Good evening. Security has been tightened in several European countries after the Paris terror attacks. Brussels, the capital of Belgium, continues to be in lockdown and on maximum terror alert. France has extended the state of emergency there by 3 months. UK and Italy are on high terror alert too. Germany is mulling deploying armed soldiers on its streets for the first time since the Second World War. Even as UK PM David Cameron has said that he favours UK joining the airstrikes being mounted by France, Russia and US against Islamic State targets in Syria, pending a parliamentary vote. Tonight we will discuss how the Islamic State terror threat has put Europe in lockdown and how there is a need for a stronger security apparatus in the whole of Europe to be able to thwart terror strikes in future. To talk about this, we are joined in the studios by Sushant Sareen, Strategic Affairs Analyst, and TCA Rangachari, former Indian Ambassador to France. I welcome you both to DD News. I'll begin with you, Mr. Rangachari. It's a well-known saying that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Are we seeing that phrase playing out in the whole of Europe, which is on a high terror alert, and especially in Brussels, which is actually in lockdown?
Well, first of all, I think this universality of the problem of terrorism now has to be acknowledged right around the world. This is not something which affects one region. And consequently, democratic countries, Europe, India, United States, wherever else, have to grapple with this problem of how do you, on the one hand, take precautionary measures in order to prevent acts of terrorism, and on the other, you stay within the bounds of citizens' liberties. I think this is something which till now, terrorism was being seen as a problem which really didn't affect, except in the case of 9/11 and some incidents which happened in Spain, in UK,
that is evidently
France
no longer
itself.
the case now.
These were in small, bombing incidents and some acts when they were sabotage and so on. In this case now, in a most gruesome way, the message has come home that we all have to be on the same page. We are familiar with this for many years now. And what it implies is, to my mind, 2 or 3 things. Number one, as we have said for a long time, and Prime Minister has emphasized in virtually all of his recent meetings, that the global response has to be the same. We can't sort of distinguish good terrorists, bad terrorists, or that this kind of terrorism is acceptable, that kind of terrorism is not. Everybody has to join together in order to fight terrorism.
We'll come to the overall fight against terrorism and whether there is a need for a
couple of other
greater
things.
international coalition. Yes.
And secondly, that it is important that we are clear what is the method we are going to use against this. Are we, as François Hollande said in the case of the Paris attacks, France is at war. Is that the method that we are going to exterminate the terrorists and wherever it exists? Or are we going to use the path of dialogue? So on this again, there has to be clarity and there has to be common acceptance and agreement.
Okay, we'll talk about the final strategy that you're talking about vis-a-vis IS and other terrorists. But Mr. Sareen, as far as restrictions on physical movements is concerned, especially in Brussels and also in Paris, is this unprecedented as far as Europe is concerned, and for how long can this continue, practically speaking? And do you see the focus slowly shifting to other areas like intelligence sharing within European countries and beyond?
Look, it's clearly a very extraordinary situation. And I'm sure the kind of terror alerts which have been issued, especially in Belgium, in Brussels, there is no parallel to that in the past. And to put a city like Brussels in a complete lockdown stage, all public transport being shuttered, is of course unprecedented. They obviously must have had some information, which is why they are reacting in the way they are, number one. Number two, I think
that is in the public domain, that there are quite a few individuals who are on the run, who are at large, and not just the one who is suspected to have played a role in the Paris terror attacks in Brussels.
There are believed to be about at least 8 odd guys, and there is an apprehension that they could be in the process of mounting a Paris-like attack inside Brussels, which is why most of the tourist spots and other things where a lot of people collect, they have been cleared. So I think there's obviously some information. This cannot continue indefinitely, but I think what the Europeans are now understanding is that the kind of games they have played, whereby a lot of these radical preachers were allowed to come and settle in Europe. They were allowed to propagate their pernicious kind of an agenda.
But that's because of
sitting in
laxity,
Europe.
right?
I think it was a misplaced liberalism. I would call it that. It was misplaced liberalism, and I think there was this belief that, you know, this is somebody else's problem. If these guys are sitting out here and spreading this kind of poison, it doesn't affect us. They're not going to hit us.
That's what Mr. Rangachari was
That's
talking
what
about.
has now started happening. So I think that's spooking these guys, and they haven't faced something like what happened in Paris. I don't think they've ever faced it in their living memories. So that's cutting very close to the bone. Now they will have to revamp their security systems. For example, in France, in the last almost a year, there have been at least half a dozen attacks which have been carried out. They were not as spectacular as the Paris one, but it wasn't for
In
lack
January, we saw a major attack, though.
Yeah,
Not
I
as major as this one,
but the Charlie
major
Hebdo one you
nevertheless.
could still rationalize in the sense that, you know, there was a specific insult, a specific reason. It's not a justification, but it could still be rationalized. But all the other attacks were pretty random. Some guy standing at a railway station and firing at a train which is going. The French were lucky that there were no mass casualties in some of these attacks. But they were only lucky. Obviously, the French security system hasn't really been able to preempt many of these attacks.
Okay.
So I think that is a problem, and the fact that in the European Union, you know, there's complete freedom of movement, there are no checks
We'll come
and
to that.
balances.
We'll come to that, Mr. Sareen.
That only exacerbates the
now,
problem.
Mr. Rangachari, how do you see, simply put, the connect between Brussels and the Paris terror attack? What do you see behind this?
Well, I think there is, if you go by the statements that have been made by those who have been responsible for these attacks, it is very clear that they are talking in terms of taking the battle back into the countries from which they perceive that either you call it insults or you call it as oppression, imperialism, whatever, you know, discrimination and so on that has been inflicted upon those
So could it
who are
partly
now,
be a reprisal for NATO action in Middle East countries?
this is what those who are perpetrating these attacks are saying. Now, look at it from a slightly different point of view. You know, if you go back to the period of the Algerian War of Independence, for a long time, what was happening in Algeria remained unknown to the public at large in France. And at that point, the FLN decided that unless you take the battle into the French public, they will not become aware. And de Gaulle was the first man who realized that this could not go on and therefore came to the conclusion that a break must be made. Now, similarly, in the case of the attacks that have now taken place, a distinguishing feature as compared to the earlier ones is that many of these people are what you might call homegrown. That is to say, they are natives of that country. They have been living in this country. In some case Belgians, in some case French. I mean, these are people who have had the benefits of living in that society. And perhaps maybe as an extension to the point that was earlier being made by Sushant Sareen, that, you know, it was not expected that those who are residing there, who are receiving all the positives of living in a developed society, would
then
turn
is the
against
Paris
that
terror
society
attack,
itself.
Mr. Rangachari, a consequence of what is being called an ethnic divide in European cities like Paris and Brussels, and the difference that is there between have and have-nots, with the have-nots living in ghettos and the haves, of course, living in plush apartments?
Frankly, I find it very difficult when people want to ascribe reasons like poverty or, you know, being in ghettos, discrimination, etc., going to the point that you are going about public spaces, snuffing out innocent lives. That, to my mind, just doesn't gel as a possible, you know, reason why you might take some extreme steps and so on. There are ways in which you can fight these kinds of problems and difficulties, both at the individual level and at the community level. Unfortunately, and I come back to the earlier point that I was making, in democratic societies, that space is open. Now, to not use that space in order to bring about a positive change in your life or to resolve problems that you perceive as in some way putting you down, and instead to go about resorting to such extreme means and spreading terror, is something where one has to look for reasons which are beyond, I might say, even rational. Because any reasonable person would say, how do I solve a problem which then benefits me?
Absolutely. Basically, you're saying that there's simply no justification for this and any
Absolutely.
rational person would not
and
go for
whether
something
it
like
is
this.
political or whether it is economic factors which are attributed as the basic reason, or even social, demographic, whatever reasons are, it doesn't make sense. The only thing that makes sense is that these are people who don't have any value for human life, and you have to deal with them regrettably in much the same way in which they want to deal with you.
Absolutely. But recently the...
Can I just weigh in on what Ambassador Rangachari said? I just want to extend that thing. You know, okay, fine. So, if you are one of those who, no, I don't mean you personally, but there are a whole bunch of these loony lefties, you know, who say that because of the discrimination, because of the alienation, etc., etc., that is why these things are happening in Europe. Then can they please explain to me why the same things are happening in Nigeria, in Mali, in Chad? Who's discriminating against whom out there? Does that justify what a Boko Haram is doing? Does that justify what a Al-Shabaab goes and does in Kenya?
There can be no justification.
So there,
for
absolutely.
Like this
So frankly, I don't buy this poverty, you know, alienation. They are cut off from societies. There has been a sustained brainwashing campaign, indoctrination, which has been going on among a certain section of the society. People are getting taken in by it. They are then given this higher purpose of life, that look, you know, you're a junkie otherwise, but if you become a jihadi, then, you know, there are rewards in the afterlife kind of nonsense which is fed into their brains. Anybody who's a junkie in any case is a brainless guy, but then he gets into this jihadist mode, and what happens is that you then take to these kind of measures. It's an ideological construct. It has nothing to do with what's happening in society otherwise, or the fact that these guys don't have jobs.
So both
or
of you are on the
ghettos.
same page on that. Now, when I was earlier referring to the issue of laxity by European Union countries, you know, one thing has come to light, and that is that there are the maximum number of foreign fighters that have gone from any EU country to fight against the IS in Syria is actually from Belgium. And there also around 130 Belgians had gone there to fight in Syria against the Islamic State, 85 of whom are from a particular neighborhood of Brussels. And interestingly, the Interior Minister has said that they really don't know who is where and exactly whether they've come back or not. So how can something like this be actually explained and justified, that the country doesn't know where the fighters are after they've come back, whether they're residing there, who they are, where exactly are they staying?
Well, I suppose that can be explained by the fact that not having experienced this problem in the past, and it's been a long past, it's not as if it's something which has happened over a day or a week or a month. For years together, if you don't have a problem of this kind, then naturally there is a feeling that it won't happen again for years to come. And therefore, the movement of citizens within or from one country to another country is something which is seen as very normal, which doesn't necessarily need to attract attention of the security agencies unless that person has come to some adverse notice earlier. In the case of Syria, considering what has been going on there, it is a little surprising that the government did not follow up to see how many people have gone up and down and what is it that they were doing when they came back. In that sense, clearly there is a need to tighten up security. But I think this debate, as far as France is concerned, is already on as to how long you would be able to prolong the state of emergency. I think here, if I might sort of come back to our own context, I think it's important that in our context, because of the kind of incidents that have taken place over the last 20 years in India, Indian public has to appreciate the need of, you know, this sort of, on the one side, fundamental freedoms, civil liberties and so on, and on the other side, the requirements of security, which essentially means, and I think we are seeing this in Europe, there is a great deal of public response and cooperation. Perhaps after a few weeks, the public might get fed up they might get upset because if it becomes too intrusive, too irksome, then people will say, no, now enough is enough. And again, there might be the possibility that there might be some further problems. I don't think this is an easy issue for any government to deal with. Where does civil liberty, fundamental freedom stop? Where does security begin? The responsibility of the government to provide security is unquestioned. At the same time, it is also, I think, axiomatic that one cannot provide security to each individual, each neighborhood,
without
each institution.
cooperation from citizens.
Even with the cooperation, you can never be sure that you are able to provide. And in a large country like India, that's that much more difficult.
Absolutely.
So the answer, the bottom line really would be for everybody to be on the same page in regard to how to deal with terrorism, and to work with each other and not get into this continuing debate about this is acceptable form and this is an unacceptable form of terrorism and so on. Whether that will happen, big question mark.
Okay. Now, Mr. Sareen, if we look at what could possible solutions be to intensify the fight against IS and to root it out, as has been claimed by world leaders like Barack Obama, the EU Interior and Justice Ministers met recently and they decided on a new set of measures that include gun control checks. That is just a part of the solution that they've arrived at. They've also decided to have greater surveillance on citizens moving in and out of the country. How crucial would these steps be?
Well, I think these are steps in the right direction, but in itself, they don't really add up to much until and unless you're going to do a whole lot of other changes. I think to just add to what Ambassador Rangachari was saying, and perhaps to some extent disagree with him, societies, whether it's in India, whether it's in Europe, they will have to come to terms with the new reality, which is that this kind of a security threat and this specter of terrorism is going to hang over these societies for the foreseeable future, a couple of decades at the very minimum. It's not going away as soon as we would like it to. So that's something that means you have to make adjustments in how societies are going to organize themselves, number one. Number two, I think it's extremely important, especially in Europe, their security services were not really geared up to meet this kind of a challenge. I was reading somewhere that the French have something like 3,000 people who are looking at this kind of a terrorism. You have 3,000 people to man something like 5.5 million potential, a population of 5.5 million.
So they need to spruce up their resources.
You need to spruce up your resources, and frankly, to just tail one guy if he is not using any electronic equipment is a logistical nightmare. It's not that you can just put one guy on to tail somebody for 24 hours. It doesn't work that way. So that means that there's a lot of investment you'll have to do to beef up your internal security systems, in which the kind of measures you're talking about will certainly start playing a role, because you will have to have some kind of border checks. You will have to have some mechanism that people who are going out, say for example into Turkey, you keep a check on these guys.
There's also an agreement to share database on passengers who go to airports and fly.
Passenger manifests, all of that. But other than that, so that is at the internal level, at the domestic level or at the regional level. Beyond that, I don't think there is any way you can defeat the IS by dialogue or something like that. I think you will have to exterminate them. That is one. But that is not going to be the end of the problem, because if it's IS today, it will morph into something else tomorrow. Just as Al-Qaeda morphed into IS, and we've seen these kind of mutations taking place in the jihadist organizations. So, which means that you have to then start combating that ideological roots of this problem, and that is something, that fight has still not been joined. Other than this, I think what states around the world, if they're serious in fighting this menace, they will have to give up this double standard which they adopt, that we can do business with the Taliban, they are partners in peace, but IS is not acceptable, given the fact that the Taliban are as barbaric and as big a savage. They've carried out the same kind of savagery which the IS is doing today. So if you start making these distinctions, then I'm afraid you've lost it. And finally, if you do the kind of side deals, Turkey saying that I'm going to turn a blind eye to what the IS is doing because
Turkey has made arrests though after the
yeah,
Paris
they
terror
might have
attacks,
made
yeah.
arrests, but they've also been buying. They've also benefited almost $1 billion by some estimates from the oil smuggled by the IS, which actually gives money in the IS coffers. They have also turned a blind eye to all the thousands of people who have been making a beeline for IS going through Turkey. So the Turks didn't know what the hell was happening. Obviously, they knew, they turned a blind eye to it because it served their purpose. They were facing a challenge in their own Kurdish
So these
areas.
double standards vis-a-vis terrorists
So I think
should
that
end. We've
needs
heard
to
often
go. That needs to
this
go.
comparison and the distinction between good terrorists and bad terrorists that we have denounced often. But if you talk about border checks, practically how difficult would it be to have them between European countries, especially where there is a system of the Schengen zone there, where 26 countries are signatories. You don't need to carry a passport while moving from one country to another. You have a common visa zone. So an entire system will need to be reviewed for such emergencies.
Well, yes, of course, review must go on continuously, and I suppose all governments would be doing that. But in the specific case of the European Union, there is a system in place, which is that at the first point of entry, a check is supposed to be made. Once you have been cleared at the first point of entry, thereafter you are free to move. But it's not as if you can enter into the EU without any check at all. Now, in the case of one of the terrorists, I'm not sure if it was this chap, Abu, who was killed the following 2 days or 3 days later. He had actually passed back and forth, and there is a record of his having passed through one of the EU countries. Clearly, there was not enough at that
No, one
point
of
to
the
detain him.
terrorists who is at large, one of the suspected terrorists, has actually moved out of Paris to Belgium.
Ultimately, it's a question of creating a foolproof database, foolproof human intelligence system, and having a perfect record about everybody, which may or may not be doable, particularly in regard to a lot of anonymous individuals who are coming in from outside. But what is the basic problem? The basic problem you are facing could be either cross-border or it could be homegrown. Now, in the case of this latest attack in Paris, it is a bit of both. Therefore, while you are in a position to control perhaps the cross-border part of it, you may not necessarily be in a position to control what is homegrown. And that is where the juxtaposition with
And
civil
some of the
liberties comes in.
indoctrination would also be happening online. And then there is this threat of ISIS hiring technology experts to hack into classified information. So one war has to be fought on that front as well.
Well, the cyber part of it is not only the terrorists who are doing it. There are others, who are into it. Some even as established government programs. Some of it is for commercial purposes. Some of it may be for other unlawful purposes. But again, indoctrination. Indoctrination is something that has to be combated both in a cross-border sense as well as in a domestic sense. Now, how all of this can be achieved, because this is a problem which is now assuming new dimensions, and therefore new solutions will have to be found, is not something to which any government would have a ready answer, which is where international cooperation becomes very essential. As you were saying earlier about database, exchange of information, continuing cooperation between the security agencies, and ultimately, I have to say, this is something with some regret, I say this, that one has to perhaps accept a degree of curtailment of one's liberties and freedoms. Where you draw that line is something we will all have to ponder over and perhaps come to our own conclusions.
So that's your
different
prescription
in
for
different
countries
contexts.
and individuals or citizens. What would you say, your last word, Mr. Serene?
Look, I think in a sense, Europe is much better placed than, say, countries like India. Given the kind of technology they have, given the kind of surveillance systems they already have, they can have checkpoints at various places.
Not to forget the numbers.
And of course, the numbers most important. So it's not such a big nightmare for them, but they just need to start putting in place the systems. That's one. So I think that much they can handle. The other thing is that just compare the resources which, say, a terrorist organization like the IS has, and the resources which all the states together can pull in. You talk about they have some tech experts who are hackers and stuff. How many of them do they have? Do they have that kind of software power which, say, the Americans, with the Brits and the French and the Indians and the Chinese can all bring to bear? It won't even be a fraction of what these countries can bring to bear. And yet, how is it that they are able to start influencing people, and all these behemoths, technology behemoths, are left twiddling their thumbs? One. Number two, in terms of resources, the Americans is a $14 trillion economy. The IS is a $1 billion economy. It's a no-brainer. Where is the comparison? And yet, if they are able to do what they are doing, it is because they are carving out and clawing out space because of the various contending interests which are preventing all these other countries from coming together. You block that space for the groups like IS, and you will start getting the dividends. You keep with your own conflicts and your own interests, they'll keep clawing out space, and they'll keep becoming a bigger nightmare than what they already
So
are.
it's a message for unity between countries to fight the ISIS and other terror organizations. Thank you so much, Mr. Rangachari and Mr. Serene, for speaking to us on DD News tonight. So while parts of the Europe are in lockdown, and Brussels especially so, what is important is that all countries put their act together and strongly unite in this fight against the Islamic State and other terror outfits. With that, we conclude this show. Thanks for watching.